Well, good afternoon, everyone in the room, and those of you watching online. Welcome. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA School of Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, What do Documentary Proof of Citizenship Requirements for Voter Registration Accomplish? Before turning to today's program, let me tell you about two upcoming other events at the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Details on these events and registration information is available at safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. On March 31st at 12:15 p.m. Pacific time, we'll have a webinar, Combating False Election Information, Lessons from 2024 and a Look to the Future. The panelists are Alice Marwick of UNC, Kate Starbird at the University of Washington, and Joshua Tucker of NYU. On April 10th at 12:15 Pacific time, we'll have another webinar. This one is Partisan Primaries, Polarization, and the Risks of Extremism. The panelists are Julia Azari of Marquette, Ned Foley of Ohio State, Seth Maskett of Denver University, and Rick Pildes of NYU Law School. So thanks today for joining us, and thanks to Ben Austin DeCampo and Harley Ham for their important logistical assistance with this and all of our events. Today, I'm pleased to have this excellent and very timely panel on documentary proof of citizenship requirements for voter registration. Let me introduce our panelists before turning to the questions. And for those of you who are in the room, you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the program. If you're watching online, we don't have the ability to take your questions, unfortunately, that way. To my right is Secretary of State of Arizona, Adrian Fontes. In 2022, he was elected as Arizona's 21st Secretary of State. He's a proud Arizona native, a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, father of 3 daughters. He served on active duty from 1992 to 1996 and was nominated for a meritorious commission. As a recorder, Secretary Fontes revolutionized the election system by ensuring that every eligible Arizonan had access they needed to vote. He enhanced ballot technology and increased process transparency, winning recognition awards from election organizations across the country. Secretary of State Fontes has testified before Congress about threats facing election officials. To my far left, just geographically speaking, is Walter Olson. Walter Olson is Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. He's known for his writing on law, public policy, and regulation. His first book, The Litigation Explosion, was one of the most widely discussed general audience books of its time. It led the Washington Post to dub him the, quote, intellectual guru of tort reform. Maybe I should have you back in my torts class next semester. His books have stirred discussion on topics ranging from workplace law to mass litigation to the state of law schools. He is the founder and principal writer on the longest running blog on law, Overlawyered, which ran from 1999 to 2020. Nina Perales is the Vice President of Litigation for MALDEF, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. In that role, Ms. Perales supervises the legal staff and litigation docket in MALDEF's office throughout the United States. She's best known for her work on voting rights. She tried and successfully argued the U.S. Supreme Court the first case that ruled in favor of Latino vote dilution claims under the Voting Rights Act, LULAC versus Perry. She also secured the first ruling from the United States Supreme Court that struck down racial gerrymandering of Latinos in Abbott versus Perez. I won't read all of her accomplishments because we will run out of time. She also specializes in immigration rights litigation, including leading the case striking down an anti-immigrant housing ordinance in Farmers Branch, Texas, and the defense of DACA in a multi-state challenge to that initiative. All right, so why are we talking about documentary proof of citizenship laws today? The primary reason is that these laws have been passed in some states, and they are now being considered as part of federal legislation, something called the SAVE Act. We'll be hearing a lot more about it, I suspect, in the next few weeks as the House takes up this possible measure. Arizona is one of the few states with one of these provisions already in place, and so I'm very pleased that Secretary Fontes is with us. Secretary Fontes, Arizona is one of the only states to have this law actually working. How is it working? Is it working well? What problems have you faced? And how much of an impediment do you think the law is for voters? How much non-citizen voting is it preventing those? So what's your overall take on how things are going in Arizona with this law.
Well, first, thanks for having us. Glad to be here, and thanks everybody that's here. Let's start with like the really core question here. Documented proof of citizenship laws create significant burdens on systems, significant burdens on voters, and they have very, very little, in fact, de minimis benefits insofar as quote unquote securing our elections. Just think of this for a moment. In all presidential elections, only presidential elections, not primaries, not presidential primaries, not state, local elections, et cetera. Since 2004, so over the last 20 years, just presidential generals, 933 million ballots have been cast. And since then, only 85 instances of someone who's not an eligible citizen have been identified. Now that's 0.000001%, which has less than a de minimis impact. It is virtually undetectable because it doesn't really exist. The idea of non-citizen voting is an absolute red herring designed specifically to subvert voters. Who is it designed to subvert? There's a whole slew of them. The list ranges from naturalized citizens, older and rural citizens, younger and low-income voters, women, minority communities, and et cetera. And by the way, there are already penalties for this, because at the bottom of every voter registration form, the individual who is registering has to swear under penalty of perjury that they are a United States citizen. And if that doesn't deter someone who, for example, may be in the process of becoming a citizen, then that's really problematic. This is a really, really bad idea, and it doesn't work well, particularly when you have really bad data at the federal level, really bad data at the state level, really bad and poorly supported systems at the state and federal level, because there's never enough funding for good information technology systems. And I'm talking about a pragmatic, practical day-to-day application here. And you couple that with the complications of the way each and every state operates those systems. Most of it comes from the motor vehicle division. And so I'm talking about from a pragmatic space here, from the day-to-day application space. When I was the Maricopa County Recorder, when I first got elected and inaugurated in January of 2017, I was elected in 2016, I showed up to that office and we found 96,000 voter registration forms that had been summarily put to the side because there wasn't documented proof of citizenship accompanying them. We did over 200,000 hours of overtime work that we paid for to try to settle all this up. Turns out in the most egregious cases, some eligible citizens were denied 17 different opportunities to vote. And many of those folks had tried to register repeatedly. This is just a bad idea if you're not willing to support this kind of a system. Now, I have a dream scenario that I'll discuss a little bit later. You talked about the problems. Here are the problems. We don't have good IT systems. Those systems don't have good data. Nobody wants to actually fund this thing, and it's going to harm all of those categories of folks that we've already indicated, as it already has in Arizona.
Can I ask you just, if you could just describe logistically, how does it work? So let's say I move to Arizona, I become an Arizona resident, and I want to register to vote. Now, I know in California, I can go to the DMV when I'm getting my new registration for my new driver's license. I can choose to register to vote. What happens in Arizona? Like, just what is, I just want people here to get a sense of how this actually is implemented on the ground.
Well, based on some litigation that recently came down and a ruling from the United States Supreme Court, what we have in Arizona is an absurd outcome because of the way a lot of these laws were written and the way it's just been pushed around. So if you go to the MVD, you can register to vote if you have the documented proof of citizenship with you. If you don't, then there has to be follow-up by your local county recorder. This is the county registrar of voters in Arizona. They're called the county recorder. I think here in California, it's clerk and recorder. Let's say you want to register with a paper form. So you go online and you download one of the federal forms. You could mail that in and try to register that way. Let's say you get a state form, some group is organized and they've got state forms from their local clerk. You can try to register that way. Every single mode, every single method, however, is going to result in it's going to give you a different result. Let's say, for example, in every one of those instances, you're giving the exact same information on that document. If you're doing a state form and you don't have the documented proof with you, you are summarily rejected. And the registrar is barred not only from registering you, but the paperwork gets thrown away. If it's a federal form, however, then you get to vote a Fed-only ballot if you don't have that documented proof of
Meaning you
citizenship.
can vote for president and Congress, but not for state and local
President,
offices.
Senate, and Congress. We have a bifurcated system in Arizona. So imagine you're an election administrator, and now you not only have to track whether or not someone is eligible based on the variety of data systems, but you also now have to track which ballot they get. Do they only get do they get the Fed-only ballot, or do they get to vote in all of the elections that they would normally have been eligible for? And my contention is this: doesn't the fundamental right to vote belong to the citizen, or does it now belong to the regulator to deny? Like, this to me is at the heart of all of this. So it depends on how you enter the system. Will tell you how you get treated, and that's inconsistent.
And just one last question before I turn to the other panelists.
Sure.
Okay, so I moved to Arizona, I want to register, and it says documentary proof of citizenship. What counts? What can I, what paperwork?
Well,
I have a real ID
here's the
in
fun part.
California. Is that good enough?
Here's the fun part. Who maintains the data behind the real ID? Which clerk at which motor vehicle division office or contractor for the motor vehicle division office? Because a lot of them are run by private enterprises. And in fact, in August of 2023, there was an Auditor General report showing that the contractors who do this work for the motor vehicle division, these private businesses, were letting just about anybody get just about any documents they wanted. And they indicated in the Auditor General's report that this could allow terrorists to register vehicles and get driver's licenses and vote. So it's not so much about what the law says, it's about how the law is applied and whether or not the resources exist to make that happen. This is, to me, where the practical application world should be part of the discussion. But as it stands, none of these folks are actually talking about how it's going to work on the ground, which is the question you asked. It's complicated.
Nina, you represented voters around the country. Before Arizona, there was cases in Kansas, because Kansas had a similar law, which a federal court had.
And then there was Arizona before Arizona.
That's right. So what are you seeing in terms of the experience of voters? What are your concerns? Are there constitutional questions that are raised by these kinds of laws?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to be on the panel. So based on what we've seen in litigation, and these cases have gone a number of times to federal courts. So based on the record that has been developed in these federal court cases, this is evidence vetted by federal judges. I would say overall what we've seen is that documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration has a significant negative impact on voter registration overall. We know from Arizona and from Kansas in those cases that tens of thousands of people who tried to register to vote were unable to do so. These laws have a broad effect on everybody. And then on top of that, they tend to have a significant disparate effect on certain populations within the general population of citizens, just like Secretary Fontes said. And the work that we did at MALDEF highlighted not just the fact that it makes it harder to register for many, many people, everybody, basically, but naturalized citizens end up in kind of the toughest spot because of the way these laws approach it. So in Arizona, I think we saw maybe about a 30% drop in voter registration from the first rollout of Prop 200 from 2005 to about 2007, when we closed the record on the litigation. We compared that back to the same election cycle, right, apples to apples, and saw about a 30% reduction in voter registration. And of those who were rejected, only a third cured. So we tracked the folks who tried to register to vote, were rejected for lack of documentary proof of citizenship, and saw, okay, did they try again? Were they able to fix it? Only about a third were able to do that. 2/3 remained unregistered by the time we finished compiling the record together. My client, Mr. Gonzalez, tried to register twice and was rejected twice for his voter registration. So very similar. He tried to register when he came out of his naturalization ceremony. There's usually a table there, League of Women Voters or another organization. You've just taken the oath of citizenship. You have the tiny little flag on the stick. People are super excited. Mr. Gonzalez did. He followed the instructions perfectly. But in Arizona, as in many other places, folks don't know how to draft legislation. So they asked him for a number from his certificate of naturalization, a beautiful scrolly number that he was required to put, and he did. That number can't be verified anywhere because Arizona asked for the number on the certificate of naturalization. He was rejected because the number is incapable of verification. So he tries again at his daughter's urging. He goes online this time. He puts in his driver's license number. He's super excited. He is a qualified US citizen, but he's rejected because in the Arizona motor vehicle records, they have a notation that at some point in the past, he had a green card. That's generally how it works, right? You have a green card and then you become a US citizen. But because of that old record, right, he was rejected again. We ended up winning that case in the US Supreme Court with respect to federal elections, which then caused Arizona to bifurcate its roles and adopt an even more complicated system for voter registration. Kansas also rejected about 12% of first-time registrants under its statute, which it enacted in 2011. That was also, eventually, those provisions were invalidated by a federal court. So the legal issues arise out of a federal law called the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. I know maybe you guys weren't around in 1993. It was a big deal because every state kind of had their own system. Only half the states allowed you to register by mail. The other half the states, you had to be there in person. And folks weren't really being offered the opportunity to register to vote. So Congress said, look, we're going to mandate at the Motor Vehicles Department, people should be offered voter registration. We're going to make sure every state can register voters by mail. We're going to offer voter registration in social services offices. That big step forward since the 90s created the reality that you live in today, right? Where you go to the motor vehicles and you're offered voter registration, where anywhere you go, you can use a postcard to register to vote by mail. These are things that happened as a result of that statute. Now, with the new legislation that's been proposed, we would take a big step back from that. And the reason I say that is because I would like to ask you here, how many of you, I walked over, and there was all these folks like with signs and things reminding me to go to mass tomorrow, and they're like, do this, do that, buy the brownie, all of these things. So let's say you're walking across campus, you're not registered to vote, you want to register to vote. Raise your hand if you're carrying documentary proof of United States citizenship on you right now. And your driver's license doesn't count, so put your hand down if you were gonna put it up, okay? It's often a Canadian. Got a Canadian in here? They're nervous, they carry passports. If you picture this as sort of a representative sample of people who might want to register to vote, right? And here's my question to you, let's say you have it. Me, a total stranger, can I photocopy whatever that document is? Assuming I have a photocopier and I'm dragging it behind me with a very long extension cord, right?
It's totally random that I have it.
But
I
you,
have a small passport.
there you go, you have a small
I
passport.
only do it because I really don't know why, because I never used to carry a wallet.
There you go.
I had to have it, so.
People are reluctant to allow other people that they don't know to photocopy important documents like passports, NAT certificates, which by the way say they can't be photocopied. And then other types of documents. I mean, we all know that we need to keep our things secure. So this would be the new reality of voter registration, that two people in this room would be able to provide those types of documents and not otherwise. It will end community-based voter registration. It will end registration at the DMV if your visit is other than one to provide documentary proof of citizenship, and other offices as well. There will be mail voter registration, but not by postcard. So you can see that this is it's not just a big step in terms of national policy, but it's also a really big step in terms of who will end up registering. And ultimately, because it will kind of freeze in place the composition of the current electorate to a greater degree than we have, younger people will be less likely to get on the voter rolls. You know, the face of the electorate will continue to age and sort of be more like it is now than it would be reflective of younger voters and also demographic change.
I think your point's especially interesting about the naturalized citizens, because I would think they would be more likely to have easy access to their papers than, say, a college student who, you know, maybe grew up in New Jersey but decides to go to Arizona State, and they're not going to necessarily bring their birth certificate with them. But it depends on the system actually being able, the electronic system actually being able to work. Or someone who changes their name on getting married would need not just their birth certificate or naturalization certificate, they might need a marriage license as well. So that sounds like a lot of complications and a lot of administrative issues. Walter, what do you see on the national scene about this? How likely is this to happen? What would it do? Is it going to get blocked in the Senate by the filibuster? What's the bigger picture nationally? We've heard what's going on in Arizona, and we've heard about Kansas, but what about on the US scene?
Yeah. Well, if Congress behaves normally, and that is the kind of conditional clause that obviously is a pregnant one, the filibuster would stop it, because under Congress's declared rules, it's not a money bill. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to bypass the filibuster in the reconciliation process and so forth.
And why would, just so people who may not understand, why would the filibuster stop this?
The way Congress has done it since it began breaking down the filibuster as an obstacle to some things, including some nominations and some money bills, is that they said, well, we're not going to do away with the filibuster. That would be too radical. We're going to keep it for substantive legislation. I'm just approximating. And so the filibuster barrier, and of course, you're not going to get enough Democrats to vote for it to prevent a Democratic filibuster. That has, in fact, blocked various types of bills that did not have enough support to bypass the filibuster. But again, with my introductory conditional clause, I have no idea how to predict whether Congress, a month or 2 months from now, is going to behave institutionally the way we can predict. So I just want to get that on the table, because it seems to me that in a simple order from the president, stop your current procedures. But please, I want to get at least one more favorable fact on the table, which is that the chair of the Senate Rules Committee is Mitch McConnell. Now, I know some of you in the audience are not used to the idea of saying, thank heaven for Mitch McConnell, but my spies on Capitol Hill say that McConnell is very likely to be good on this particular issue and has a long, long history of wanting to protect local election administrators from federal mandates, and has gone to bat for them quite a bit. And this person, who I cannot identify because you know what happens to spies, said basically you will have to cross Mitch McConnell's dead body. Now, the good news is now out of the way for the afternoon, because in 2 years Mitch McConnell is no longer going to be in the Senate, and anything could happen, even if we are on relatively normal procedure. Someone else will have the Rules Committee, and there won't be that big direct obstacle. And that having been said, I mean, one reason I'm here, I think, is that over the course of the last year, Adrian briefly described why there isn't reason to think that there is a large volume of non-citizen illegal voting. I spent months last year writing a series of articles. My colleagues at Cato have also written them about how you can look at the numbers from about 8 different directions, and they all confirm Adrian's point. You can look at prosecutions, you can look at statistics, which would show different voting patterns. If 5 or 10% of non-citizens were voting, you would see in counties and other jurisdictions that had a lot of them, you'd be seeing voting patterns differently. You don't see any of those things. So far as I can tell, there is no evidence that illegal voting by non-citizens has changed the result, the outcome, in a single federal election over the last 30 years. So that brings me back to the SAVE Act, because you would think one question to ask for everyone who might vote on it is, does this solve a big problem? So far as I can see, they have never adequately answered that. Instead, Speaker Johnson has said, well, we all intuitively sense that there's a lot of this, even if we can't prove it. Well, thank you for sharing your feelings, Mr. Speaker, but ordinarily legislation is supposed to be built. And I resort here to what I was told in Washington years ago about messaging bills versus serious bills. And I thought it was useful information for a while, because people told me that messaging bills were just intended to be something that you could go out and campaign on. They weren't intended seriously to pass. They weren't intended to solve an actual problem necessarily, or if they did anything, it wasn't actually going to solve the problem that they were announced. But they, and they could be tremendously impractical, since the object was not to actually have it signed by the president or governor. And then, of course, there were serious bills that were the opposite. Now, I eventually learned to throw away that kind of terminology, because I saw legislatures keep on passing and presidents and governors keep on signing totally impractical bills that did not solve any real problem, but were just meant to gesture for future campaigning. They got signed into law. And meanwhile, the serious bills, would go all the right procedure. They would hold informative, detailed hearings. They would listen to the minority party and absorb the best bits of its critique. And then the thing would not actually get signed, because someone decided it wasn't in their political interest. So all that effort had been wasted. So please forget everything that I say about messaging bills. But last year I did call the SAVE Act a messaging bill. If there's time, I'd like to just go into 3 or 4 of its provisions, because
Yes,
they're worth
please.
knowing about. Yeah, and I'm going to start with the least controversial. One set of provisions in the SAVE Act would instruct federal agencies that are in charge of databases to do a better job of hooking up with the states. The states have complained, and I think with reason, and the local administrators have complained, that in order to find out whether someone is a citizen or not, the best evidence is often in the hands of federal agencies, which drag their heels, have outdated databases, take forever to respond. And this part of the bill would say, this has to stop. We're going to have this system, and federal agencies need to do their bit. That might even be good enough to get a bipartisan bill passed. I don't know. The second part of it is to say that we're going to overhaul the MVRA rules, under which states had to accept certain type of application, which was not as strict about a couple of these issues as some states had wanted. Now, as someone who sympathizes with the constitutional design in which states can go their own ways on a lot of these things, I have some sympathy for that. I would like states to have wider leeway to experiment than the NVRA necessarily gives them. However, this was done in a Washington way, which is not to loosen things up so that there can be a wider range of state practice, but to make mandatory what had been forbidden and forbidden what had been mandatory. States will no longer be allowed to pursue the way of doing it that many, many states find work for them and believe to be completely secure. And then we get on to the stuff that may be uglier or more impractical, or both, which is the SAVE Act prescribes very, very stringent criminal penalties, and it doesn't bother to tell you what the conduct is that's illegal.
That seems like a problem.
It would seem like a problem, yes. And so it, starting with the penalties, there are these hair-raising, exposures to criminal liability for someone and who does things, I'm going to call it the country way. You're there at a voter registration office. Your older sister walks in. You know perfectly well that she said, well, okay, well, yeah, look, you don't need to show me. Suddenly felony. And so you've got people terrified of potentially overstepping. So they want the cookbook, they want the safe harbor, they want an exact list of instructions that will keep them from becoming a criminal. And of course, the law doesn't give it to them. It says basically, details to come later, wait for the Dear Colleague letters from an organization, the Election Assistance Commission, I believe it's called, which is currently this toothless and universally, I'm not going to say universally loved, but not universally feared, group that is meant to go out and provide genuine assistance to the states. All of a sudden, it would be transformed into a regulatory powerhouse that would get to issue Dear Colleague letters saying, you have to start doing this, and you're no longer allowed to do that. Now, to be fair, some of the criticisms you've seen of the SAVE Act on viral social media are not actually right. They do not, at least in the eyes of its framers, like Congressman Roy, it is not intended to prevent women who've changed their names on marriage from registering, and Congressman Roy says that we foresee you'll be able to submit an affidavit that simple combinations of documents or an interview with the administrator will solve most people's problems. I don't doubt that that's what they intend, if only because if they didn't intend that, it would be setting on fire election administration in most of the states these people are from. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to be frightened of. And I will just say that Senator McConnell, I think, has been right when he has tried to prevent the federal government from accumulating discretionary authority over local state election administrators. That discretionary authority can be used selectively to find violations and go after people for political reasons. It can be used in order to impose things that Congress never foresaw or intended to be in there through Dear Colleague letter. I come from the more conservative side. I remember when we generated this huge literature on government by Dear Colleague letters and why it was bad, why Congress should actually have specified what was illegal rather than leave it to the bureaucracy. I wouldn't want any bureaucracy to have that power, and in particular, I don't want one appointed by Donald Trump to have that power.
Tell us how you really feel. I will point out that when the House did its organizing, its set of rules for how it's going to run the Congress, they carved out 12 bills that would not be subject to amendment on the floor, and the SAVE Act is one of them. So it seems like it's some kind of priority.
I would expect to see it pass the House, as it did last summer, in fact.
Yes.
Yeah, because, in a sense, we already lost that last summer. We've got a House that is no more likely to see reason this time.
I want to turn back to Secretary Fuentes and talk about the litigation. One of the things, if Congress passes this law, then it's not going to conflict with the NVRA because it'll just be, it could just be changing the NVRA. But right now, there's a question about federal supremacy, and you end up with this weird, as Nina described, this weird bifurcated system where you can vote in federal elections but not state elections. But there are a whole bunch of issues, and the Ninth Circuit just issued an opinion last week in its Mi Familia Vota case. I think that's headed back to, if it doesn't go en banc, it's headed back to the Supreme Court.
No, back down.
Back down.
Well, at least on the
there's a
intent
stay.
claims
The Supreme Court put a stay on it.
The stay is there till
of the district court.
till it's all done.
Till it's all done. Yep.
Yeah. So what does this all mean in terms of for the voters of Arizona, and where is this likely to go?
Well, it means we maintain our very confusing and unduly burdensome system that's just flat out not fair, and it's not justified. Walter, I appreciate the validation on the numbers here. This is not really an issue. This is just not an issue. This is a solution looking for a problem. This is the epitome of the tail wagging the dog for political purposes, and I think it's disingenuous, it's silly, it's a waste of time, and it needs to be called what it is. The litigation, however, that could arise from it can come from a whole host of areas, not the least of which I think, was just described. Let's say, for example, you are a married woman who took your new husband's last name, why should your burden be greater? Why should you have to put an extra affidavit out there? You are a natural-born citizen, you deserve that same right to vote, and yet because of this, we're gonna put more burdens on you. And I think there's certainly some due process questions that could be applied there. Interesting note, I think the folks who drafted this didn't really pay a lot of attention to that part of the demographics because of that section of the population. If the SAVE Act, a study has shown, and I can't remember who said it, but we saw one and it was publicly released not too long ago. If the SAVE Act had been in place in 2004, the Democrats would actually have a majority in the House because the biggest majority of married women who changed their name and would have had issues are conservative voters. And so this is not just ill-advised and not well thought out, et cetera, et cetera. It's potentially damaging for the side that's promoting it politically. So that makes it stupid, if you ask me, all of the descriptors here. But there is also the other thing, and I think was really interesting that Walter pointed out, two of the things that I thought were great, the criminalization of election officials and clerks who are just doing their job. Right? Imagine you're a clerk and you make not great money, you know you're serving the public well, you've got a semi-decent retirement coming, and all of a sudden your job, maybe just because you made an honest clerical error, is gonna lead you to a felony prosecution. Are you gonna stick with that job? Are you gonna still do that work? And over the last several years, we've had an enormous exodus of election administrators, seasoned professionals from the profession because of the threats and intimidation that came out of the big lie. And so we've already got what is a profession that's been chopped off at the knees as far as raw numbers and experience, and now you want to criminalize the most basic, well-intended thing. So I think that there's definitely a problem there that the litigation could give rise to. But on a more practical side of things, and I think one of the critical things that Walter pointed out, I find myself agreeing with you a great deal, Mr. Olson, and I kind of like that. The legislation on its face tells us that we can't depend on the data. It tells us that the data interchange between federal and state databases is a disaster by mandating, hey, you guys got to fix this. But what is also evident, as Mr. Olson pointed out, there's no money attached. It is an absolute unfunded mandate, both for federal and state governments, to do something that is to fix something that's admittedly a mess, ask everyone to rely on the data that is admittedly a mess, and then not give any money to help try to fix that mess. This SAVE Act is total garbage. And it is a foolish adventure that we're on, even pretending like this is a serious issue and serious legislation.
So on your first point about the election workers being subject to criminal liability, we've already seen people who engage in voter registration drives feel deterred from engaging in registration activity in places like Florida and Texas, where you make a mistake, you could face criminal liability. And so there's been lawsuits over that. And so we know that these laws can have that kind of effect. Nina, I don't know if you had a chance yet to look at the opinion that just came out in the case, but one of the things that really struck me, and this is totally flying under the radar, even I think a lot of election lawyers are not aware of this, but one of the arguments that Arizona is making is that Congress does not have the power to regulate presidential elections. Yeah. So just to give everyone a bit of background, Article 1, Section 4 says that states get to set the rules for congressional election subject to congressional override. That's the authority for the NVRA and Voting Rights Act and Federal Election Campaign Act and lots of other laws. If you look at the regulation of presidential elections, all it says is in Article 2 is that states set the manner, Congress sets the time. There's no congressional override there. But the Supreme Court, since I think it was 1934 in the Burroughs case, has assumed that when Congress is regulating congressional elections, it can also regulate presidential elections. But in this case, Arizona is saying, no, that's not right. And the dissenter in the Ninth Circuit, the panel dissenter, Budame, said, yeah, that's right. The Supreme Court should overturn Burroughs. And the result of that would be that Congress would not have the power to set the rules for presidential elections. So two-part question to you, and then I would like Walter to weigh in on this too. It's like, what? No, that's not my question. No, it's like, what would be, how likely is that to happen, that the Supreme Court would take that idea up, when it eventually makes its way up? And what would the implications be for voting rights?
Oh, my goodness. That's a hard question. First of all, I don't predict what the US Supreme Court or any court will do. As a litigator, I think it's the mark of a foolish litigator to predict what any judge is ever going to say in any case. So I'm always the one disappointing my clients. They're like, what do you think is going to happen? And I'm like, I will not say. This could be such a wacky issue that, like the independent state legislatures issue, the Supreme Court will like find ways to dodge it for as long as possible and maybe forever. Or, once again, we're going to end up with a decision that says, Congress can regulate. We're not going to overturn Burroughs, but you're going to get these heated dissents from a minority. It's hard to picture the Supreme Court adopting a rule that would sort of unleash that kind of variation in state election rules when it comes to presidential elections.
And what would it mean if the court did go that way, in terms of, what would states be able to do now that they can't?
Like what Arizona was hoping to do, which is to say that, so even after I mentioned we won at the US Supreme Court, Arizona bifurcated its system, then they got sued again, and then they had a consent decree. Well, they went ahead in this most recent legislation that is the subject of the current lawsuit, they went and rolled back again, right? So sometimes you have states that say, well, we don't agree with prior court rulings, so we're going to just enact that same legislation again. And this whole presidential thing was a move like that, I guess you could call it. Arizona knows that if you don't provide documentary proof of citizenship, you should still be, and your application is otherwise complete and fulfilled and you're eligible, you should be registered for at least federal elections where the National Voter Registration Act sort of governs. But Arizona went and passed a law that said, if you don't provide documentary proof of citizenship, you can't vote in presidential elections in Arizona.
And on the emergency stay, if I understand this right, Justices Gorsuch and Thomas and Alito would have allowed those who had already registered using the state form without providing documentary proof of citizenship to only be able to vote in congressional elections and not presidential elections.
Yeah, so now you have three different styles of ballots.
Three different voter rolls.
And three different voter rolls.
And three
can I
different
just,
voter rolls.
like, Nina, just to be fair, not everybody in Arizona wants to do this crazy stuff.
No, that's very true.
Not everybody.
That's very true.
This is why you should invite people from the Cato Institute, because you will hear defenses of things that may seem indefensible. I haven't, unfortunately, read Judge Budame's dissent, but I believe I know exactly where he's coming from, because we've spent a lot of time on those non-parallel clauses, why Congress does get the supervisory power with congressional elections, but does not get it for presidential elections. When it has come up, I have tried to calm people down by saying that the practical inconveniences of decoupling them would be such that surely everyone would behave reasonably and arrange the laws so as to allow continued coupling of them. But of course, I have had to drop all of the subordinate clauses about if everyone behaves reasonably for the last couple of years. And so I can't feel as sure that decoupling would not happen. And you might wind up being presented with multiple ballots. You already see that with not only the split rolls, but also in Maryland, where we allow our municipalities a great deal of leeway to create a lower voting age or allow non-citizens to vote who could not vote in federal. So you get a lot of equivalence of split roll issues in which people are, sometimes you can do it by the tabulation, sometimes people are actually genuinely using different machines or using paper for one and machine for the other. Come to Maryland and learn all about making elections much more complicated than you think they have to be.
Well, it would also have implications if this were applied to federal campaign finance law, for example. Congress wouldn't have the power to limit money in presidential elections.
Yeah, I haven't tried to do a study of the cases, but I do know, as those three justices signing on to that, and exactly the ones I would have expected to, that there is intellectual interest in the Supreme Court's conservative wing in that text.
Okay, so we'll have you all back in 3 years or 4 years when this case works its way back, and we can talk about it. I have some more questions, but let me just see if there's any questions that anyone in the live audience has. Yes, please.
I was wondering how this is, because I know Arizona is a large Navajo nation,
Yes.
and I was wondering if it has affected them, like showing citizenship, because I know
Yes.
they don't have access to a lot of their documents.
Huge problem.
So that's, in the litigation that I'm referring to, that came about after Arizona adopted documentary proof of citizenship in the 2004 election. One of the first victories was on behalf of Native American voters who now are able to place a number on their registration application that is a tribal enrollment number. There is no database by which to verify this number. So for the people who think that there are massive numbers of non-US citizens registering to vote and voting, which is a false belief, this would certainly be a wide open door for anybody who is, plotting to get around the proof of citizenship, would be to put a number for tribal enrollment in the box that's on the form for tribal enrollment, which I think just highlights is the absurdity.
And so a couple of fun little details. Imagine you were in you lived in one of the southern Louisiana parishes right before pick your hurricane, and all of the records are gone. And you moved to, I don't know where, and now suddenly you want to register to vote. Your birth certificate may not exist, okay? There are so many different ways that these documents may just not exist. And as to the point that Nina just mentioned, and to your question, there are, and this is really fun because it gets to the heart of where the practitioners actually understand how this works, and excluding us from the conversation is the worst thing you can do. The Tohono O'odham Nation, for example, transcends over the US-Mexico border. And there are members of that nation who were not born in the United States, but they're still members of that tribe. So when folks, particularly in Washington, DC, with their ideologies and stuff, want to start dictating things at folks and not actually ask the folks on the ground, what's going on? What do you need? How can you make these systems work better? They're wandering blind in a house that they've never seen. They're going to run into walls all over the place. But I do think that there is a way to achieve the goal, genuinely. I really, really do. And it's really, I think, it's got to involve a whole lot of people, and it's going to take a ton of money. And that's why I don't think it's going to work. But, with some legal adjustments and some proper funding into the IT systems that we have, we could achieve the goal. I think we could achieve the goal. But it would also mean that we would have automatic voter registration. Because if the data exists in these systems, what justification would you have for not registering somebody if they walked into a polling place if you have access to all of this data at lightning speed? There's no reason to deny this person the right to vote. And so again, this is another reason why I think this is a quote unquote problem that nobody really wants, that the sponsors don't really want to solve, because if they actually solved the problem they say they want to solve, everybody is going to be automatically registered to vote, using really high-speed, low-drag information technology systems that are dependable and accurate, and now who's voting? Everybody who turned 18 on that day or before, right? Everybody who's, and the data exists, we can do this. We can actually make these systems work. I just don't think this is a serious proposal.
I have something to add.
Well, let me just come on this and I'll come back to you. I've long proposed doing what most other countries do, which is automatic voter registration coupled with a national citizenship card, a national identity card with all the costs paid by the government. I'd say it like, that's one thing that unites Democrats and Republicans. They all hate it, but for different reasons. But it sounds like there might be movement here. And Nina, before I come back to you on the other comment, let me just ask you, Walter, do you think that there could be bipartisan compromise, maybe in a post-Trump period when there's more negotiation with the parties, like a grand bargain? Everyone's going to be automatically registered to vote, and we're going to make sure you're a citizen.
I don't know whether you can get a grand agreement on the automatic registration. You might possibly be able to get one on the national identity card, even though I have to say, as someone with the Cato Institute, which will hunt me out and fire me if they ever hear me say a favorable thing about national identity cards. The fact is that given what is now close to the #1 demand of the successful incumbent organized conservative movement wanting a national identity card, and given the various progressive objectives that would also be served by having one, you certainly might see some conversions on such a card. It's, for various reasons, people, I think, prize, certainly in the Republican tradition, that people prize the idea that registration is a separate thing and that they need to, get the one database and then you vote at a later point. I think if I could just echo a couple of points that Adrian made, though,
Then I do want to get back to Nina, because she was in the queue.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make a quick point that it's sort of been
Then I'll come
implied
back to you.
in all of this, but there is no US citizen database. If you're thinking, oh, maybe Social Security, no. There is no universal US citizen database. And so if somebody were to try to register to vote without documentary proof of citizenship and say, well, can't you just look me up somewhere? As Secretary Fuentes said, there's kind of databases all over the place, but there's nothing integrated, there's nothing universal, there's nothing that is complete. The most complete database would be for persons who are born abroad, right, and who immigrate to the US. You would have naturalization data there, but otherwise, there really isn't a way to like press a button and check, right? So that is what causes documentary proof of citizenship laws to then require people to go find documents, photocopy them, fold them up, put them in an envelope, put a stamp on them. And one of the things I was curious about with SAVE, and this is what I wanted to end with, is what are the bypass mechanisms? I've met people who have no documents.
Sure.
In Arizona, I met a white woman whose mother was a hippie and crossed into Mexico to have her because it was cheap. And then crossed back in. This woman was a US citizen from birth, in the same way that Ted Cruz is, by the way. But she didn't have, yeah, well, he was Panama, anyway, it's complicated. She did not have a document. She would have had to do quite a bit of work to get herself a document showing her. So I thought, okay, what are the bypass mechanisms? And they appear to be going in person to a registrar and sort of producing what you could. I just want to say, I live in a county with 1 million to 2 million people in it, Barrett County, Texas. It's huge, it's where San Antonio is. We have an elections administrator, retiring now, Jackie Callanan. She has 22 people who work for her. I do not understand how 1 to 2 million people and the sort of rush of voter registration that we get could possibly ever appear in person and get that done. Not to mention, my own daughter was registering before the 2024 election. She's in New York because she goes to school there. Right? What happens when you can't come and plead your case? It is logistically impossible.
If I could comment really quick. Oh, go ahead.
Well, Walter was waiting.
Well, just on Nina's point, I think that it would require a wartime footing, as it were, because conscription, mass sudden conscription is the analogy that I think of to everyone having to go in and do interviews and establish various things, and of course they would ramp up tremendously. I would worry that it would be a federal workforce because, rather than just expect tens of thousands of municipalities and things to do it, they would say, look, we're going to create the equivalent of a selective service system, with unthinkable implications for, at any rate. But that's how they do it. They would decide that we were in a national emergency footing and that it had to be everyone's top priority to, again, I wish this would solve a real problem, but go ahead with what Adrian was.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find interesting, and Walter, here's where we're going to kind of part ways a little bit, is the notion of, yeah, it's okay to have national ID, but we want to decouple that notion from automatic voter registration. If the data is there, and we know who is 18, who was born here, and who doesn't have a felony conviction or some other restriction, then we already have a voter roll by default. And so the notion of separating those two, I don't know what the logic is there. Doesn't make any sense if you really want all citizens voting. If you don't, then maybe there's a reason there. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the notion of having all of this data is not something that some folks, I'll say, I won't name folks, but some folks don't want. They don't want everyone counted. They don't want every community and every person in every community to count. Why? Because that means they might be able to vote, and that means they might have power. And I look to the example of Yuma County, Arizona. After the last census, you had some communities in South County where you've got 4 new high schools, and 10,000 new homes. And guess what size population growth came out of that census? That's actually the 2020 census.
Yeah.
0.
Yes.
0 population growth with 10,000 new homes and 4 new high schools. Arizona was slated to get 1, maybe even 2 new congressional seats. Mm-hmm. But because of the political landscape, very little, if any, effort was put into actually counting the people who are there. The citizens who deserve that representation, who work hard and pay taxes. And Arizona's going to lose probably in the neighborhood of $12 to $14 billion over the 10 years that we're in right now. And that's real. So, there's deeper motivations to some of this stuff. And some of it gets a little bit ugly. But again, I'll just go back to the original point. The SAVE Act is trash.
We have time for 2 minutes, so quick question.
This is really interesting. I have 2 questions. I guess one for the more conservative side of the panel, one for the more liberal side. For the conservative side of the panel, it was always my impression and understanding that conservatives would never want national voting laws. We prefer to be at the state level. What would the House's argument be that this is different? And for the more liberal side of the panel, my question is, there's been a lot of, I feel like, sensationalism around voter ID laws. And I understand the citizenship law is a little bit different, that is, which over the past several years in certain states. In Georgia, as an example, I think President Biden called it Jim Crow 2.0, and then they had the highest voter turnout they've seen in any election after the law was passed. More people turning out across the board, communities of color, white, everyone. Why would this be any different?
30-second responses.
Okay, well, it's easy, which is that the conservative movement that I thought I grew up with has completely thrown overboard its commitment to federalism and of most of the Constitution.
And my quick answer is to answer, because I consider myself in the middle, to answer your question for the conservatives. It's in the Constitution. Congress sets the time, place, and manner of federal elections, right? So can't really get around that unless you amend the Constitution. On the voter ID side, it's a longer conversation, but I will say that when you're consuming information about voter turnout, be careful when somebody says there are more voters turning out, because Georgia's a fast-growing state. We would expect to see numerically more voters turning out each time. I think you want to ask kind of the next question and the question after that, which is what proportion of registered voters is turning out, what proportion of eligible people are participating. Because, and I come from Texas, same thing. There's always going to be a bigger number, but that may mask a subtler effect within the electorate.
And just
Last
attack
word
on
to you.
just attack on the last bit. specifically as to Georgia, what amount of money was put into GOTV efforts. It was enormous in Georgia. And so the organizing is naturally gonna, it's gonna tend towards more folks actually getting the education, more folks figuring it out, and more folks actually being able to navigate because there's paid assistance to get more voters voting. So there's, I think, as Nina said, there's a lot more factors, and that's a much longer conversation. But that's a really good question. Yeah, and just last, I'll just say this. Why should you show an ID? If it's your fundamental right to vote as a US citizen, why should the government put an extra burden on you? It's your right. It's the government's job. It's my job to ensure and protect your right to vote. Why should I be in a position to make it harder for you? Or if you're a married woman and you take the name, or if you're a Native American and you live on the, why in the world shouldn't your word on a piece of paper subjecting you to felony perjury charges be enough? It's your fundamental right that I'm trying to protect, not some crazy dream about all of this undue influence. This is, to me, the most fundamental question. The voters need to be at the center of this conversation, and they're not. The conspiracy theory is. And that's the biggest problem we're facing right now.
We're going to have to leave it there with those provocative final words. Let me remind you that our next event is going to be on March 31st at 12:15 on combating false election information. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next time. Please thank our panel.